I'm actually a fan of the Treasury orthodoxy, the belief in markets, the importance of discipline on the public finances, those sorts of things. And I think that Healey will definitely be a challenge to that orthodoxy. And as I say, whether you think that's good or bad depends partly on on your own perspective.
Let's go to Julian Jessop, first of all, who's an independent economist. He's worked in government and in the city. I'd love to get some more reaction, actually. Julian, good evening, on the appointment of John Healey as chancellor. Julian, what do you make of this?
Well, I think the initial reaction is positive. He's widely seen as quite a strong, credible figure who'll be able to make some tough decisions. And he has the enormous advantage for the markets, at least, of not being Ed Miliband. That was the choice that they were worried about. But I think there might be some second thoughts coming in here for a couple of reasons. If you look at his background, he's got very strong links with the trade unions. He had senior roles in communications and campaigns with a number of unions and the TUC. So he's very much from that sort of left-wing anti-Treasury perspective. And of course, he doesn't have an enormous amount of relevant experience. He was a junior minister at the Treasury a few times, but he doesn't have sort of private sector experience or business experience that I think the markets will feel more comfortable with. So I think the markets will be a little bit nervous about what might come out over the next few days. I think we will have to wait for the budget itself for any major fiscal announcements. But I think the markets might be a little bit nervous that they're getting somebody who's still definitely from the left wing of the Labour Party.
Yeah, he is quite pragmatic as a person, quite stoic. He's certainly not flashy. He's different, of course, to Andy Burnham when it comes to Andy Burnham with all the personality and the sort of empathy and sympathy about him. He is relatable, whereas Healey is a bit more stoic. I always get the impression, having spoken to him a couple of times, that he's much more of a much more of a pragmatist. So it'll certainly be an interesting relationship. Is he strong enough to deal with the Treasury? One of the criticisms of Rachel Reeves was she never really got a proper handle on the Treasury. Do you think Healey will do a better job at that?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask that because as a former Treasury official myself, I'm actually a fan of the Treasury orthodoxy, the belief in markets, the importance of, discipline on the public finances, those sorts of things. And I think that Healey will definitely be a challenge to that orthodoxy. And as I say, whether you think that's good or bad depends partly on your own perspective. I think there's certainly some things to watch. One is, of course, that he is very keen on spending more money on defence. So that's additional pressure.
That is now nailed on, isn't it, effectively,
exactly.
Julian? Sorry to interrupt
but also,
you.
I suspect that part of the quid pro quo for Ed Miliband taking the Foreign Secretary job rather than being Chancellor is there'll also be a bigger increase in spending on overseas aid. So I think the combination of Healey getting the job at number 11 and Miliband going to the Foreign Office means that we get more spending both on defence and on
But then how
overseas
is that going
aid.
to square? Because obviously we took away from our foreign aid budget to fund defence in the immediate.
Well, that's right. I think that's an obvious tension. I would hope that that's offset by restraint on spending elsewhere in the budget. But I think given that Healey, of course, has quite strong roots within the trade union movement, that's unlikely to mean big cuts in welfare spending or rolling back on some of the relatively expensive reforms of labour market regulation. So I think this is all pointing to more taxes one way or the other. And I think that's going to keep the markets nervous.
Yeah.
It looks like we're heading for a blockbuster budget in the autumn. And in the meantime, of course, more speculation about borrowing, tax and spending, which we know was so damaging this time last year.
Julian, a couple of questions more for you. The immediate response after Andy Burnham spoke outside Downing Street, of course, he talked about the UK needing a new economic model. He talked about immediate help for those struggling with the cost of living tomorrow, to be announced tomorrow, including how he's going to pay for it tomorrow as well. I mean, that is hitting the ground running. That is impressive for many. But the markets weren't so keen, and I just want your measured opinion on this, really.
No, you're right. I mean, the cost of government borrowing in the UK has been rising over the last few weeks, and it rose more today in the UK than it did in other countries. I'd still say that in the short term, the key driver of the cost of borrowing is going to be global inflation fears and events in the Middle East in particular. But that looks like that's going to be an unhelpful backdrop. Oil prices rising again. And I think the UK, therefore, will be singled out, not just because we've got relatively high inflation, but also because of the additional concerns about the budget. It is worth stressing that there are constraints here on how much the government can announce in the next few days without triggering the fiscal lock. I mean, ironically, this is one of the legacies of Rachel Reeves, is that if the government announces a big increase in tax or spending, that has to be accompanied by a formal OBR forecast. So I think we'll just get some what I'd call political gimmicks over the next few days, things like a lower cap on bus fares. The big stuff will wait until the autumn budget. But that in itself is a problem because of all the speculation and uncertainty in the meantime.
Yeah, and look, we've been on overdrive with speculation, haven't we, over the last 4 or 5 weeks or so? Just one final one. So Andy Burnham had taken journalists into the Rose Garden, actually, to give them some embargoed lines. They came out at 4 o'clock. So we got a new sort of raft of information, some more detail on Andy Burnham's plans. He says he's going to use any flexibility in the government's fiscal rules that could allow him to borrow billions of pounds to invest in infrastructure. So if you're borrowing to invest, then there are certain mechanisms that you can do that without busting the fiscal rules. Do you think that is viable? It is something I thought that we'd heard from Rachel Reeves already, but what could Burnham do here?
Well, yes, I mean, the fiscal rules do allow you to increase borrowing as long as that's borrowing to invest. But there are still some constraints there. I mean, first of all, the overall amount of borrowing reflected in the stock of debt still has to be falling a few years down the line. But also, of course, any borrowing, whatever the purpose, is still more borrowing. And the markets are nervous about that. I mean, it's all well and good if the borrowing is for useful investment that boosts economic growth and so on. But the OBR has been quite sceptical about that. It's been reluctant to score these measures as big positives for either growth or the public finances. So, yes, I mean, he can probably increase spending and that still be allowed within the fiscal rules. But that doesn't mean that he's going to get carte blanche from the markets to borrow as much as he likes.
Look, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Julian Jessop there, who's an independent economist, has worked in government and in the city as well. Really interesting to speak to you, Julian. Thank you. And one of the biggest pledges made by Andy Burnham in his major speech was to tackle the cost of living and give Brits more breathing space, is how he termed it.
I will bring forward a new plan for Britain. A 10-year plan, laying out a path from where we are now to where I believe we all want Britain to be, wherever we're coming from, whatever party we support. But I can do something to give people some breathing space now, some help with the cost of living. And I will set out some of those measures starting tomorrow.
OK, Andy Burnham there. But what does he mean and what might it look like tomorrow? What is needed and where will the money come from? He says he's going to explain it all. But let's seek the opinion of the chief economist at the Resolution Foundation, James Smith. James, good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks so much for being with us, James. Look, I wonder what we might get. We've had a few hints, but that is quite something to promise on your first full day in office, isn't it? Immediate breathing space, and it's going to be costed. What do you think we're going to get?
Well, it's obviously all happening. It's very exciting. I'll leave the political analysis to the others. But the substance is encouraging, as you were just getting at. So hearing that we're getting support from the cost of living, that's just to be clear, that's super needed given a huge rise in the cost of essentials, so 50% for energy, 40% for food. And that crucially hits lower income families hardest because they spend more of their income on those items. So what could he do? That's definitely a tricky question. And a lot of what's driving up that cost of living, the global price of food, the global price of energy, that's not in the gift of the Prime Minister. So that makes this hard. So the places he should be looking to really intervene is in those essential items. So the cost of housing, the cost of energy, thinking about what he could do on the cost of transport. I think we may hear some of that. I agree with your previous speaker, Julian, who said the big ticket items are probably coming with the budget rather than tomorrow, but there are things he can do in the near term. So what might those look like? Well, some of them, he could operate through the benefit system. So people in the private rented sector who claim housing benefits, they've been struggling. There's a huge gap between housing benefits and the price of rents in the UK. Energy is the big place where the cost of living has really hit, and here the government needs to be targeted. So we might not get full details of this tomorrow, but what he needs to do is provide support for families on low incomes with high energy needs.
Okay.
And then the other... So those would be the priorities. No, those are the key things here. That's where he should be thinking about operating with those essentials.
Yes, he was asked today, there was a briefing for journalists in the Rose Garden at Downing Street after he'd given his big hello and welcome speech in front of Downing Street. He said he's considering rent controls, cost of living support tomorrow. It could make a difference this year, so we know it's going to be immediate. Cutting energy bills, as you said, bus fares are another thing to look at. So it's small. I mean, if I'm to be cruel, I might say it kind of piecemeal measures, but they are measures that he can say, politically, I suppose, he can say, well, on my first day in office, I lowered bus fares, I introduced rent controls, and I cut energy bills. I mean, that's probably ambitious for all those aspects, but it gives him something immediately to hang his hat on. He's also talked about cutting income tax for lower earners, and this would be looking forward to the budget. But I know our listeners will be interested in this, and maybe particularly in that 50 pence higher tax rate, the idea of whether he would reintroduce it. It's 45 pence at the moment. He's refused to rule this out today, James, that'll go back up to 50 pence. And he's talked about perhaps unfreezing the personal allowance at 12,570. It's been frozen for 5 years. He says it's become a growing issue. What do you think about both those different things?
Well, we're getting these tantalising details, aren't we? Just revealed a little bit at a time what Andy Burnham might do. But the swap seems to be unfreezing the threshold for starting to pay income tax. So that's been stuck for several years now, and that obviously, it's dragging more and more people into paying higher tax. Unfreezing that would cost something like 4 billion. Which is a big number. Unfreezing all the thresholds in the tax system will cost more like 14 billion by the time you get to when the fiscal rules bind. So this is expensive stuff, and even that 50p tax rate, that's really going to struggle to pay for that. That's more like 1 billion in terms of what it raises. So there's some gaps in the sums here. But the key thing to keep in mind here is when you're cutting tax, it tends to boost people with relatively high earnings, because everyone, apart from the very, very highest taxpayers, everyone gets the benefit of that starting threshold for paying income tax. So if you want to help people on low incomes, help people really struggling, then that's not the place to intervene.
Look, James, great to speak to you. Thank you for being with us. James Smith, Chief Economist at the Resolution Foundation. Thank you.